first of all, let me give you a little format of the conversation. We're going to open with Scott giving some thoughts for a bit, and then I'll have a conversation between Scott and John. And there are cards in theory by the table, and we're going to try to do this Commonwealth Club style to a bit, which would be, if you have questions, please fill them out, and we'll try and take a few of them as the evening proceeds. So first, let me set the stage this way first. I want to read a passage from 1L, Scott's brilliant book that he wrote decades ago now and turned out to be the start of an incredible literary career. This is from Scott's diary. It's Monday morning, and when I walk into the central building, I can feel my stomach clench. For the next 5 days, I'll assume that I'm somewhat less intelligent than anybody around me. At most moments, I'll suspect the privilege I enjoy was conferred as some kind of peculiar hoax. I'll be certain that no matter what I do, I will not do well enough. And when I fail, I know that I will burn with shame. By Friday, my nerves will be so brittle from sleeplessness and pressure and intellectual fatigue that I will not be certain that I can make it through the day. I am a law student in my first year at the law school, and there are many moments when I am simply a mess. That's the opening page, actually, in Scott's book. And of course, we all know the paper chase. I'm so proud to be John's colleague. And John's book, of course, was made into a movie. And why don't we take a look at what Professor Kingsfield's class was all about? Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Scott Turow.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here in the centennial of this great law school. I was, for 5 years of my life, a San Franciscan, so I'm well acquainted with USF and the law school, and have had the pleasure of having dinner with two friends from Chicago, Justice Mary Jane Tice of our Supreme Court and her husband John Tice, with whom and against whom I practiced law for many years, and they are both emblems of what any law school should be proud to claim as its own. I have to say I'm just the person that a great law school would want to have commemorating its 100th anniversary, talking about legal education in the 21st century, which is to say someone who has no idea what I'm talking about. I overstate this a little bit, but of course I graduated from law school in 1978, haven't been back since. I don't teach, unlike Jeff and John, so what I have to contribute is mostly secondhand. I'm basically a reporter. I visit several law schools every year. I have a daughter who graduated from the University of Michigan Law School in 2006, and I followed her progress pretty carefully. I speak with the associates at S&R Denton and interview law students from time to time. But I am not, like these two gentlemen on the scene. But from my limited perspective, when people say, how has law school changed since the days of 1L, I will say it has changed, but probably not enough. Probably the happiest thing that I can report is that the kind of brute patriarchy of Professor Kingsfield that's portrayed in that opening scene of the paper chase, that's probably pretty much a thing of the past. It's lessened, or in some places it's completely extinct. And And that's due to a number of factors. One, I think, quite frankly, is the entry of women into the legal profession in large numbers. And the other is consumerism. You know, the advent of the U.S. News and World Report rankings made it a competitive marketplace for law students. And law students figured out that if they could go someplace and be brutalized and go someplace where they weren't going to be brutalized, they would prefer the latter. Even a place like Harvard, where John and I were both law students, the changes that have come there, and they've been significant, but they were driven, frankly, by the fact that Harvard began to lose students to Yale and to Stanford. There are other changes, not only the classroom milieu. Every school now feels the necessity to have some smaller classes, like the legal writing classes here. They now teach statute law, where it might not have been taught before. Public service, which was kind of an alien concept when I was at Harvard Law School, and I think to that extent Harvard probably was behind USF School of Law. Every exam I took at Harvard Law School started with the same assumption. You are an associate in a large law firm. Literally every exam question. And that is no longer the case. And schools like this one take pride in being able to send students out to work in the public sector, to contribute to the public good in a lot of different ways. And there is a good deal more teaching of how to be a lawyer in law schools. In my day as a law student, the law faculty basically disdained the practice of law. It was really the old adage that the A students teach and the B students work for the C students. And now contemporary legal education takes pride in teaching law students how to be practitioners. Trial practice classes, negotiation classes, statute drafting classes. These are all salutary changes. There are still frontiers left to conquer. Large classes remain pretty much the norm in American law schools. Grading based on a single exam at the end of the semester or the year is also pretty much the norm in American law schools. And the latter sort of contributes to an emotional frenzy at the end of the semester and at the end of the year. But I do think probably the best change is that the law teachers of today are willing to accept the fact that law school is essentially a tender time in a student's life. And I don't mean to say that anybody believes in coddling law students, but because of the great change in legal education, I look at a book like 1L, which continues to sell robustly, and I look at that and I say, what is it that drives that? Because obviously people approaching law school or in law school are finding something in my account of being a law student that remains current. One, of course, is the fact that 1L is, without doubt, the sort of diary of an unabashed neurotic. And every law student can read 1L and feel confident that he or she is not going to be that completely crazy. But for me, when I went to law school, I had left Stanford, where I'd actually been teaching. I had been a creative writing fellow there, pursuing my dream of being a novelist. And all of a sudden, I went back, went to law school. I found myself in the cheap seats, not at the head of the classroom. And for me, it was very much a crisis of identity. Was I a person involved in the law? Was I a novelist? And I think my experience is frankly emblematic of what all law students go through. They go to law school hoping to forge a professional identity. And, you know, we really, as practitioners and you as teachers, ordain them in the priesthood of the law. And we teach them that emotion is no basis on which to argue, that arguments must be supported by facts. We teach them a very strange and elect vocabulary that we employ as lawyers. And as a result, law students often tend to feel that they're being surgically removed from themselves. Now, the irony, of course, is that's exactly what they signed up for. They want to become different. They want to change. They want to become professionals. But I do think that that today's law professors approach that process not with contempt for their students' weaknesses, but instead with appreciation of them and with a great deal of gratitude that they're able to have a shaping hand at a dynamic time in their students' lives. So I think to a great extent today's law schools are kinder and gentler places, but also, certainly like this law school, better places to learn the law.
Thank you, Scott. You know, I'm tempted to say we could have saved you a lot of angst if you had spoken to me and I could have told you to come to the University of San Francisco School of Law. But let me try to get a little personal here, and I'd like to start with a question for both of you, but I really want to start with John. You know, John, your route to the law seems to me a little more obvious than Scott's. Scott goes to Amherst. Scott is a writer, goes to creative writing school. You, however, my man, are a descendant of John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the United States, hence John J. Osborn. You go to college, you go to law school. And I guess my question is, why did you go to law school? And equally important, what were your expectations of law school? And while there, what happened that you would write the paper chase? And Scott, I'd like you to think about that also. What happened in that short period of time that you would write something like 1L?
Is this working? Okay. It's kind of unnerving because I can see myself on the screen. So anyway, I'll look at you instead. Okay, I'm supposed to have a really important answer for this, which is something like, I knew from my father and grandfather and great-grandfather that I should carry on the Osborn tradition of going to law school. But I'm going to tell you the truth. I was madly in love with a girl at Radcliffe, and she was going to be a junior, and I was graduating. I mean, I was toast unless I could figure out a way to be at Harvard. So I applied to the law school. And here's an amazing thing. I did not get in. I know, unlike Scott, I didn't get in. So I went down to the admissions office and I said, look, I'm madly in love with this girl. You gotta let me in. You've made a mistake. And they said, we're Harvard Law School. We don't make mistakes. And I said, will you look? Because in those days, you carried around thousands of paper files and put them on things. And they said, no, we're not going to look. And I bugged them every day for a month. And this is actually true. And they looked, and they made a mistake. And they let me in. So the end result of this was a really lucky thing. Not that I wrote the paper chase or anything like that, but I am married to Emily Osborn, who's up there, and I've been married for 44 years. That's why I went to Harvard Law School.
Well, John, not to take anything away from Emily and the importance of all of that, but surely when you went to law school, you had some thoughts about what it might mean to be a lawyer.
Yes, I did. And I could answer that. We don't have enough time for a really long answer. But when I was at law school, everything was going on at Harvard. We had the Harvard strike. I mean, it was just wild. For the first time, people were waking up and saying, why are we taking this crap? You know, I mean, it was the Vietnamese War. Why are we doing this? And literally at Harvard Law School, the very first time, people said, why are we taking this? Why do they do this to us? I'm not going to put up with this. Now, it wasn't just happening at Harvard. I was writing The Paper Chase, but at Yale, a guy named Duncan Kennedy was writing a book called Why the Law School Failed, which became very important in this movement. Stuff was going on in law schools all over the country, and they were basically saying, why are we taking this? We were looking for a different kind of law school. Think about this. And I don't want you stop me if I'm going on too long.
Believe me, I will.
Good. Okay. We were looking for a law school where you walk down the corridor and it's covered with student organizations that the students found. We were looking for a law school where the dean reads every single student evaluation of every single course. Can you believe that? That's the kind of law school we wanted. We were looking for a law school where every professor's door is open for any student who wants to come in at any time. That's the kind of law school we were looking for. We were looking for a law school like USF.
Thank you. Scott, does that description of John's rebellion, whatever you want to call it, match your own experience? Or what? I guess the question is, what were you expecting when you went to law school?
You know, I had been a writing fellow at Stanford, as Jeff mentioned, and in the course of my 4 years there, I wrote a novel called The Way Things Are. And The Way Things Are was about a rent strike on the north side of Chicago, where I come from. And the novel hinged on something called the implied warranty of habitability, which was the contract term being imported into American law, saying that a tenant has a right to rent a dwelling he or she can actually live in, as opposed to the fiction that the tenant was renting the ground under the building. Of course, as you might expect, the implied warranty of habitability it was not the stuff of bestsellerdom. And more than 24 publishers in New York rejected that book. But I was fascinated by it, and I was fascinated by why the law changed, its ability to equalize power relationships. And it seemed really exciting to me to be a part of that, as opposed to going on as a professor of English, which is, to say the least, a noble calling, but not one for which I had the same kind of appetite. And so I left academic English and went to, and decided to go on to law school. At that point, I had the problem of explaining to my literary agent, who had dragged my novel about the rent strike all over New York, what I was doing. And I got halfway through this letter to her and realized it sounded pretty lame. So I wrote in the second half of the letter that, you know, it had dawned on me that there was not a good nonfiction account of what the day-to-day life of a law student was like. And, you know, The Paper Chase was out there. It was a great novel, but I didn't think I was going to fall in love with my contracts professor's daughter. There were books by professors telling students what they ought to think and how they ought to feel. And I was saying there really should be a nonfiction book, just a memoir of the day-to-day of a law student. At no point in time did I think that I was proposing to write that book myself. But my agent went out to lunch with a editor named Ned Chase, may he rest in peace. And Ned, among other things, was the father of Chevy Chase, and he was every bit as zany as his son. And he decided to write a contract for this book that I had not proposed to write.
Okay, so this is now 1977. The paper chase has been out since, 71? 1972. And Scott describes what led him and sort of his goal in writing 1L. And it's interesting because both of you reacted very quickly to your environment. I mean, you basically wrote it in the middle of law school, and you actually started it, as I understand it, in law school. As compared to what Scott just noted, what was the goal in writing The Paper Chase as you saw it?
Well, it's interesting to listen to Scott. And by the way, it's been an incredible privilege to be here. And this is going to embarrass this guy. But he wrote a book called Presumed Innocent, and it just changed the bar for what every other lawyer who wrote fiction wrote.
Thank you,
So,
John.
a funny thing had happened. I had wanted to write we're going to put things on the table there. I went to Harvard. Well, you already know Harvard College. I left from Belvedere in Marin County and went to Harvard College. I'd never seen it.
Is that near the Lower East Side?
What?
No, that was a joke.
But so freshman year there, I thought I was going to become a writer, and I signed up for a poetry seminar, but you had to give them your poems to see if you'd get in. And the guy who did this poetry seminar was a guy named Stephen Sandy, who was an instructor. Luckily, he never got tenure at Harvard, and I like to think that he's teaching in Alaska somewhere. Anyway, he read my poems and said, "Osborn, these are terrible. You should not go into English, and you should not try to write poetry or anything else like fiction. I see you as sort of a geologist." So anyway, I decided to become a history major instead. But when I got to law school, I was now a law student. I was going to become a lawyer. It didn't matter what Stephen Sandy thought. I could write because my identity wasn't tied up with it. And so, I started writing The Paper Chase partly because I felt so liberated being a lawyer, and I just wondered if you felt that same way.
I really think I had found my voice as a writer in my years at Stanford. But what I didn't have was a subject. And I have always said that the great break of my literary career was going to law school, because it gave me something to write about that I have always felt a passion for, and that is the law and its problems. And that began with the first day of law school. The problems with which the law wrestles, which really are, in many cases, moral in their dimension, have always spoken really deeply to me. And so I was very fortunate that I made this U-turn in my life.
It's interesting. I felt the same way, by the way, about contracts, because as I started taking contracts, I realized that it was the moral voice of business. I mean, it read those, moral rules into it, and you could pretend that you were laissez-faire, Darwinism, but if you really understood contracts, you understood that there was a moral basis for it, and that gave me something to write about. That law school.
It's interesting listening to that good exchange between the two of you. I think if you ask the average law student what they take away from The Paper Chase or from 1L, despite the depth of the novels, it's often the scene we've seen or the excerpt that I read. But listening to both of you, you talk about the law and its moral dimension. You talk in very romantic terms about the law. So I guess my question is, looking at what the books say, is it fair to say that your law school experience was not nearly as negative as might be perceived by those, the casual reader of the book? Scott, why don't you take it, and then John?
Well, my law school experience was painful, and it was painful for the reasons that I've indicated. I can blame Harvard Law School for lots of stuff, but I probably would have been equally anguished as a student at the USF School of Law. I was making a big change. I was giving up what I thought I was giving up was a lifelong ambition to be a novelist. I was turning that in for an area that I had discovered on my own. And, you know, I wanted to be good at the law and put a lot of pressure on myself for that reason, because I frankly felt that I'd failed as a novelist. So those were all factors that were really extrinsic to what any law school, you know, can be held responsible for.
Well, I guess, I mean, I had good times at Harvard Law School, wonderful times. But there were a lot of real SOBs teaching. I mean, they really were, and I don't think they all left before you were there. Yeah, I mean, and I was ticked off. I mean, I didn't understand why I should be treated that way. You know, I've discovered, let me tell you something fun. This is just not, this won't answer the question. I don't call on anybody in my contracts class. You've got to raise your hand if you want to talk. Now, you got to talk at some time. And if you're so shy you won't raise your hand, come into my office. We'll go over a case. You'll know it cold. So when you raise your hand, you'll be the brightest person in class. It's great. But I have discovered this year, because I've been on a quest to understand my class better. You know, I'm sorry, I'm going off on a tangent here. But I can get my students to raise their hands without calling on them. It's an amazing thing. If I look them directly in the eye and keep looking in the eye, they magically raise their hands. You know? So why was anybody calling on anybody in the first place? You don't need it.
You know, I graduated from law school in 1969. I think we were very tough on our professors, and I've looked back and thought to myself, maybe too tough. Maybe we didn't give them the benefit of the doubt, that we thought we knew everything in ways that we really didn't. And I'm wondering, as you look back at the paper chase, and as you look back at your diary now, do you have second thoughts about what you wrote? Or do you stand by the way it was portrayed?
Well, you know, it's interesting. John mentioned that, you know, Duncan Kennedy was a student at Yale Law School who wrote Why Law Schools Fail. By the time I got to Harvard Law School, he was my contracts professor. And I thought he was a great teacher. And, you know, he was determined to smash all of the hierarchies, and so he would walk into class without a tie on, which was unimaginable, and in, you know, a dirty shirt and slacks, and he was a great teacher because he brought immense passion to the subject, and I don't think 1L, and I moved people around so that I didn't get sued. But I don't think 1L is short on great appreciation for teachers like Duncan or Lou Sargentich, who taught me torts, who I thought were doing a great job. I didn't like being bullied. And I had, you know, classroom experiences that were akin to the ones portrayed in Paper Chase. I didn't think it was productive. And this sort of, you know, game where the professor pretends to be an intellectual titan and you mental midget, I didn't think, it certainly wasn't helpful to me. And it wasn't a good thing for the students to bring them to school in a state of terror. So the criticisms I made then, I would continue to make.
Yeah. And so there was the good along with the difficult. And John, as you look back, any rewrite that you would do?
No, I'm okay with the paper chase. But I feel incredibly lucky that I got to teach at USF. Yeah. The paper chase, by the way, when you saw that very first scene, the very first scene of Heart, from Kingsfield's perspective, is a trick. Because we built that classroom. You could move the walls. So we moved the camera way beyond where Kingsfield really is, so that Hart is lost in the class. You know, we're trying to make you see how his perspective from the very beginning with Kingsfield, and then gradually the camera moves up through the scene as Kingsfield. Anyway, I just thought that was interesting. I mean, there's more to movies than you think. But all of the paper chase is going toward one point. The entire book, every single bit of it, is going to a point where Hart is going to say to Kingsfield, "Professor, I want you to know that the course meant something to me and you meant something to me." And Kingsfield is going to say, "What was your name?" That's where the book's going. It's not going to, "Here's a dime, call your mom." It's going to that scene. And the trick of the book is that I wanted the reader to believe that maybe Kingsfield didn't know Hart's name. Now, the fact is, of course, Kingsfield knows Hart's name. Hart's going out with his daughter. Hart's the best student in contracts. You're an idiot not to know Hart knows. But the point of the book is to make you think that. And if the law school can make you think that, there's something wrong with it. And I don't know if you just think about what I've just said to you sometime, because it says something about fiction. The idea is to make you actually feel the way Hart did. And if you reach that point in the book and feel that Kingsfield didn't know his name, that it's possible, then I've succeeded. Because then what I've done is made you feel what the protagonist feels.
You know, that's in the few minutes that we have left, that's a good segue, because I'd like to talk about your life as writers a little bit. Why do you write about lawyers? And I might add, why do lawyers, and particularly in your book, Scott, become the heroes that they are? What is it about the profession that drives you to write like that?
Well, to be completely honest, if you compare the heroes of contemporary legal fiction with Atticus Finch, for example, today's legal heroes are much more deeply flawed, but there's a wonderful resonance between the law as a subject in which the enterprise is always the doing of justice, and the moral struggles of the flawed characters that populate my novels and many others. And, if you look at literary trends, it's hard to understand why lawyers replaced spies and cowboys as American heroes. But the answer, I think, in the broadest sense, is that we were in changing times, and people were they were looking to a nationalized source of values. And the only place they were likely to find that was in the law. You can go to your minister, your priest, and talk to him about deep moral questions like abortion or the death penalty or surrogate motherhood. But those are going to be, in a pluralistic country, answers that aren't going to apply to everybody. And the only answer that you could find that was going to give you a national answer was to go to the courthouse. And that certainly raised the profile of the law and of lawyers.
Thank you. And John, it's not like you've stopped writing about the law since the paper chase. What's the attraction to continuing to write about it?
About lawyers?
And lawyers and the law.
I actually agree with what Scott said, and I'm not sure I can add anything to it. I mean, the fact is that these important questions, lawyers are the ones who are dealing with the ethical and moral values. They're the ones who have to argue it, so they're the place to go.
Okay, we just have a few minutes, and there's three thoughts that two from the audience, and I love this question, staying on the literary theme. What book haven't you written that you want to write?
What book haven't I written that I want to write? Boy, can Scott answer that, and then I'll come back and think about it.
I have a number of books that I want to write that I haven't written. I've always promised my son that I was going to write science fiction. So I actually have a Law of the Future book in my head. I have a book I want to write about my grandfather. I'll probably run out of time before I run out of ideas.
John, any further
It's interesting because I have a book about my grandfather that's half done, and it's tough. It's tough. Well, I'd like to write a nonfiction book about a contracts class that I'm teaching now, and try to write it from the professor's point of view. Really try to understand what it's like to teach that class and how much can the professor know about the class. How much can I have 100 people in my contracts class right now. How much can I know about them? How much can I know about them as a class and as individuals? And, and how does it work? I've thought about it from a student's point of view, so I'd like to do something from a professor's point of view. It's interesting. I'm thinking about that a lot.
And here's a question that I'll ask for a minute answer to that probably could serve as the basis of either of your next books, novels. What is the most surprising development in the law that you've seen over the last 20 years?
Why are you looking at me first?
Scott?
It's a tough question.
I mean, this is a very political answer, but I guess what surprises me is the areas in which I feel that we've gone backwards. And in particular, my own deep despair that a country in which, when we were founded, only white men with property got to vote, and we then removed the property requirement, and then we realized that slaves and Indians were human beings, and then we even realized that women were entitled to vote. My deep despair that we are reaching a point where only the rich have the ability to influence the political process, and I think it's a terrible and saddening development.
Scott has been very modest about his legal work to date. He does a lot of work in Illinois around law reform and a whole other topic we could get into about a second constitutional convention and the like that we won't get into. But John, any thought on the last 20 years?
It's interesting because I agree with Scott completely on that. I mean, it's really depressing. Anyway, the latest stuff that's been going on and trying to stop people from voting, and it's just scandalous. So.
And I guess as a closing question that I'd like to hear from both of you, I'd really be remiss if I didn't note for the 1,000th time tonight that we're here to celebrate our centennial. And given your experience, Scott, and I mean not just as a novelist, but as somebody actively involved in law reform, who's been a partner in international law firms, what advice would you give to the law school on our centennial? And John, I'd like you to think about that too. Scott?
If I think about the world in which I grew up, graduating from high school in 1966, and being the head of the youth section of the Evanston, Illinois Urban League and a board member of the National the National Association for the Advancement of Color People, to think that we have gone from that aspirational world to one where an African American sits in the White House is really inspiring. And we as Americans ought to take enormous heart from that and recognize that all of the changes that made that possible, those changes were made by lawyers who brought reform to many institutions, whether we're talking about the civil rights laws, the Public Accommodations Act of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act. Lawyers have really been in the vanguard of the arc of justice that Father Prevet was talking about before. And I can really only echo what's been said, that this is really the truest job of this law school and other law schools, if they're going to remain current, is leading this society toward justice.
Well, you know, Scott, that was beautiful. And when you and I someday build our justice building, we're going to take those words and put them in the cornerstone. And John, Scott had the first word. We'll give you the last word.
So I loved what you said, and I agree. I'm agreeing with everything Scott says. I can't believe it. But I'm going to make mine. This is about what the USF ought to be thinking about. That was the question. And so I want to tell you what USF ought to be thinking about, because I'm there. The most important thing USF needs to think about right now is how they are ever going to replace this guy. I mean, this is an enormous challenge. He has done just a job that you cannot believe, and I see it every day with a faculty that just loves each other. Now, it's true. It's amazing. It's the most congenial. I've taught in 4 other law schools. This is the most congenial law school I've ever seen by a huge margin. Now, there's another thing. The second thing that USF needs to do. Right now, I've taught at USF for more than a decade. Every time I have gone into my contracts classroom, I have said good morning or good afternoon. And they just boom it back at me. Good morning. Good afternoon. I mean, that excitement is so incredible. So incredible. They come in there not feeling entitled, just feeling like they want to participate. They are fabulous. And we need to somehow keep that feeling going. And a lot of it's because of Jeff, but there are other things in the law school, complicated things, to think that that's what we need. We want to make sure that every law student first-year law student comes in there and feels like it's going to be a great morning because we're going to talk about contract law or torts or whatever it is, that they're that excited.
That's two wonderfully inspiring answers. And you know what, gentlemen, with all due respect, what I take away from this evening, having read 1L, having read The Paper Chase, that what was in that diary, Scott, it turns out there was a lifelong love affair with the law. And John, regardless of what he went through in that first class heart, there's also been a lifelong love affair. And you too, whether it be teaching, whether it be in practice, whether it be clerking, all the incredible things that you've done, have participated in the law and loved the law and believe in the power of the good that the law can do. And I appreciate your sharing with us that lifelong love affair. And I would be remiss if I didn't say The Paper Chase 40th Anniversary Edition and 1L remains at Amazon.com. So John and Scott, my thanks to both of you.